Alright, welcome back everybody. So this is my personal tier list for the Might and Magic 6 dungeons. I went ahead and got screenshots of all the dungeons, and we're going to be organizing them based on my personal opinion. No one's going to agree on all of these. Some people value different things in their dungeons. With that being said, if you have any disagreements, feel free to leave a comment and let me know. This is unrehearsed, and this is just how I feel about each given dungeon. And I'm basing it on roughly three things. More or less, it's going to be based on the puzzles in the dungeon, the lore of the dungeon, and the general fun that comes with that dungeon. The third bit, it varies from the types of monsters you're fighting, to the types of puzzles you're doing, the layout, the time investment, all those kind of things. It's incredibly subjective, so this is just my personal opinion. And with that, we can get started. So the very first one on the list is the Abandoned Temple in New Sorpical. I believe that this one is S tier. Now, I understand that it's a pretty basic dungeon. There's not a whole lot in this dungeon. The monsters aren't that interesting. It's spiders and cobras, bloodsuckers, a couple of rats. It's not terribly crazy. There's no real puzzle elements to it. There's one trapped chest with a little bit of that adventuring flavor thrown in, the one that shoots sparks everywhere every couple seconds. And there's a teleporter way in the back. There's not a lot going on in here, despite a couple of quests. It's a very obviously low-level dungeon. So why do I think it's S tier? Well, I think it's S tier because although it scores pretty average marks in the general fun of things, it's a 20 out of 10 for the lore. Because I think that I found something in here that no one else has thought about, and I could easily be wrong, but I believe that there's a deeper lore aspect to this dungeon that makes it what it is. So, if you talk to some of the people around New Sorpical, they'll tell you that there was a curse that the Temple of Ba was trying to put on the town, the curse of endless vermin, or whatever it's called. And that's neat. It's thematic. They tried to summon some critters and vermin to mess with the town, and it backfired, and they all had to escape. Well, I don't believe that's what happened. What I believe happened is based on the front of the dungeon and the very back of the dungeon both being man-made. You come in, and it's a temple, obviously crafted. They have artworks, they have rooms and doors, they have bricks laid, clear-cut stairs, and all those kind of things. And then you go a little bit farther, just a little bit farther, it turns into just a cave. Well, why is there a cave here? That doesn't make any sense. Well, I think there's a cave here because what the Temple of Ba were doing, I think that they moved into this temple with the intention to connect it to the Temple of Ba in Iron Fist. Whenever you look at the map from a bigger picture, it nearly would have connected where that Temple of Ba had the four corner caves with spiders and things like that in them, in Iron Fist that is. It nearly connects, but because they ran into these man-made structures, something went wrong. They got off somewhere, and they ran into some type of a sewer system. And then if you just look up at that sewer system where there's a chest next to the teleporter near the Spider Queen, there's a hole in the roof. Well, clearly something went wrong. So what I believe is they ran into that sewer system, probably one roughly connected to Iron Fist, which inherently runs into the Dragoon's Keep. Outpost? It's the Dragoon's Outpost. And then that's whenever the, there's air quotes here, Temple Curse of the Vermin, or whatever they called it, backfired and it let all these things in. That, I believe, is where it came from. Because there's also rats and things in the Dragoon's Outpost, and there's also spiders in the Temple of Ba in Iron Fist. So it makes sense to me that based on all that, it was the sabotage plan that they were trying to establish by having these connected temples of Ba that would result in easy, secret access between the two. But it didn't work. They accidentally ran into all these monsters, and they had to just abandon the entire project. And it holds true, because these are just random peasants that just decided to follow the Temple of Ba. And it all backfired. So with all of that, I truly believe that this is a very interesting dungeon on that ground. I'm going to give it the S tier, right out the gate. Now the next one up, we have Agar's Laboratory. Agar's Laboratory is a relatively overlooked dungeon because it's on the north side of Castle Craigspire, basically in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing out there, there's no quests associated with it. Off the top of my head, I can't even think of anything that would point you to that area, unless you just decided to go there for some reason. The monsters in there vary on two polar opposite ends of the spectrum. Agar's monsters are no big deal. They're trash monsters, you hit them a time or two and they're down. The easiest ones have about 55 hit points, the hardest ones have maybe 90, I think it's 87, but I don't remember on the top of my head. They're not strong. They're magic immune, and that's great, but they're easy to beat, and they're relatively fun. Their loot's fine, that's good. But the downside to this dungeon, they have those floating eyes. I think anybody that's ever played Might Magic 6 can agree that we do not like the flying eyes any type of way. Through walls, they'll remove your buffs, they do a lot of damage, they cause status effects, there's nothing fun about fighting them, they don't have good loot on average, they're just not worth it, they're not fun to fight. There's a light puzzle aspect to it. You gotta flip some switches in certain types of ways. There's a few hidden things in there. The chandelier with the diamond in it. And then you do get to fight Agar, and that's fun. Agar has a long backstory in the Mimetic series. He personally created Agar's monsters, obviously. He created Minotaurs, the floating eyes, and maybe one other thing that I'm forgetting. But him based on himself. You find him as a lich, decently fun to fight, but nothing too crazy. So because there's not a lot going on with this dungeon, I'm going to be giving it a C tier. The only saving graces here, the only reason that it's not D or F tier, is simply because it's a quick and optional dungeon. You don't have to go in there for any reason. If you choose to, that's great. If you don't, no loss. And it's pretty much that simple. Now, funny enough, we're going pretty much right back to Agar with Castle Alamos. That's the next one up. Castle Alamos, I'm going to be... I imagine some people are going to disagree with this one. I'm going to be giving it an F tier. I hate this dungeon. I do not like going in this dungeon. Whenever I have to go into this dungeon, my only goal is to get out of this dungeon as quick as possible. Typically, I enjoy fighting humanoid type monsters. But the humanoid type monsters are all magic users. They deal a lot of damage, they're way too tanky for what they are, they're backed up by elementals, which are universally one of my least favorite monsters in any game ever. I just don't like them. It's a long, complicated dungeon. There's not that much good loot. There's a decent puzzle element to it that I personally have never figured out. I don't know how you would figure it out. I just know that J-Bard is the answer. So I skip the entire thing every single time. I do not like Castle Alamos. The puzzle's annoying, it's too long, there's no enjoyment in fighting the monsters. There might be some lore aspects that are neat, but I just don't like it. Everything that I attribute to Agar, making him an interesting villain in the game, actually happened in his laboratory. So Castle Alamos itself, I don't want to deal with it. We're moving on. It's an F tier dungeon. Now the next one up is Castle Darkmoor. Darkmoor is an interesting place, in my opinion, that is the Mire of the Damned. It's the official name. Darkmoor ranges from Corlegon's estate in Iron Fist all the way through the mountains that border Dragon Sands. All of that is Darkmoor. The name is pretty obvious there. It is dark magic, and it is a moor, a swamp, so that's what it is. But Castle Darkmoor, I don't think I like it. The puzzle elements are fine enough. They're not overly annoying, except for there are 3 types of enemies that you fight. You fight the Flying Eyes, and that's going to go ahead and bring us down to a B tier at best. The second I have to fight one of those things. And there's even more than in Agar's laboratory. The ogres are a fun thing to fight. They're tankier than goblins, and they're more fun, in my opinion. But then liches, they're kind of like spice, really. There shouldn't be too many of them. You wouldn't take a bite out of a piece of garlic. You know, you would put it into your food. I'm not going to go eat an onion. You put onion on the food. I don't want to go fight 50 liches. I want to fight the lich's army and then have the lich as that extra thing, that boss monster, the Lich King, you know, those types of deals. So because of that, I'm going to be putting this at a D tier. It's slightly better than F tier because I enjoy fighting ogres, but I do not like it. It's very long. The puzzle can be annoying. There's floating eyes. None of that makes for a very good experience, and generally people just don't like this dungeon. I am one of these general people. It's not my thing. Now next up we have Castle Craigspire. Castle Craigspire's primary enemy type is Minotaurs. Now Minotaurs, and if you see my other videos, you probably know this one, but Minotaurs are my absolute favorite being in any fantasy world. I love Minotaurs, or as Absolute Zero says, monitors, but it's pronounced Minotaur. If you don't know, Absolute Zero, he kind of inspired everything that I do. Go check him out. He has an 8-part Let's Play that is an expert Let's Play. My best attempt isn't even close to what this guy does. He basically solos the game. But Castle Craigspire, it's not terribly long. It's not terribly difficult. The monsters are typically fun. There's a few of Agar's monsters in there, and that's just thematic because the Minotaurs were also created by Agar. He mixed the bull with human, and it went sideways because it just kind of accidentally took the worst of those two things and mashed them together, and then now we have Minotaurs, and that became everybody else's problem. It is what it is, but it's a good dungeon. There's light puzzle elements to it, not too bad. It's very survivable, and I'm okay with that. I'm gonna put this at an A tier. It doesn't go above and beyond in any real ways to make it that S tier, although I do love Minotaurs, and I wish they were used more. I think Lurch is an interesting enemy, just because he exists, and I wish I could remember what he was a reference to. I think it was the Addams Family or something, but I don't personally remember. It's a good dungeon. I would absolutely go into this dungeon and actually play through it. In addition, the loot rewards are fantastic because you can find horseshoes in there, and horseshoes are gold in this game, even though they are horseshoes, not Minotaur shoes. But bringing us to another Cragspire dungeon, we have the Caves of the Dragon Riders. So in the Caves of the Dragon Riders, you're going to find two types of enemies. The first one, of course, are the drakes. They are the dragons being ridden. They're weaker than most dragons, and they're a pretty fun enemy to fight. They have a few resistances and things of that nature, but they're still decently fun. I'm gonna plug my microphone in to make sure it doesn't die. And then you also fight the Death Knights. Now, I think I could have been wrong about this one, and I can't verify this one way or the other at this point, because I haven't looked into it as I should, but I believe that the Death Knights are humans in armor. I don't think they're undead. I just don't know. I've actually never used Destroy Undead on anything, because that spell's awful. It is what it is. It's a totally optional dungeon with a little bit of lore thrown in, and that's definitely neat that it exists. I wish I could tell you off the top of my head what exactly the lore was, but I'm sure it has something to do with why are Death Knights around. I just don't remember. Totally optional. Fun enemies to fight, although these are humanoids that use magic. I also really like Death Knights as a class. In World of Warcraft, my second favorite class to play is the Death Knight. They're just interesting. I think a plate mail battle mage is an interesting concept, and I really like them. I'm going to be putting this at an A tier. There are no puzzle elements to it, by the way. But it's short, it's quick, it's fun, the loot's very solid, and I'm sure there's lore in there. I just can't remember exactly what it says. So that brings us to the next one, back to Darkmoor. Corlegon's Estate. Corlegon's Estate is a relatively low-level dungeon for the... it is the... one, it's either the second promotion quest for wizards that bring to an archmage, or maybe it's the Hourglass of Time. I can't remember off the top of my head now that I'm thinking about it. But you go in there for Isaac Newton, or whatever, Albert Newton, whatever his name is. It's an undead dungeon. It's pretty long, but it is pretty easy. Skeletons are typically fun to fight. Except for the curse they can put on you. That gets very annoying very fast, and I don't like it. If you're doing these dungeons as intended, you might have a cure curse laying around, but the chance of being able to teleport out, resolve your curse, and go back in, unlikely. Typically, I'm way over leveled when I do this, and you can see why I'm so over leveled doing this if you go watch my advanced startup guides. typically this is a pretty quick, easy thing. I can blast through the entire thing, it's no big deal. I know most of it. So the puzzle elements is just doing it in the right order. If you do it all as intended, the way the developers want you to do it, it will take you a good while to complete this dungeon, and that just kind of is what it is. It's not overly challenging, and if you go in at a higher level with telekinesis, like we saw in my last playthrough, you can actually find artifacts in there. I think we found Cronus, which I don't remember if we used it or not, but I think it was Cronus that we found, and that's pretty impressive. So the biggest downsides are that I don't like dealing with curses. Anything that can one-hit kill you, like the ghosts or the specters, I don't like those either. I really just don't appreciate that mechanic. Ghosts aren't typically too fun to fight, but they are glass cannony. If they never get their effect off, then you're fine. There's no ranged anything to worry about, although they do fly. It's a pretty easy dungeon. It's just long with a few mechanics that I don't like. There's light puzzle elements. Again, I'm going to be putting this at a C tier. This next one is pretty simple. It's the Devil's Outpost. By the time that you get the quest to do this, you're way too low level to do it. So your best case scenario, you go in, you kill the one Devil of Ba, grab the thing and leave. And it's that simple. Worst case scenario, you fight through the whole thing, and it takes you however long it takes you. The devils in there can break your gear, they cause a lot of damage, they have status effects, they're not a ton of fun. There's nothing much to this whole thing, but the Devil's Outpost was there because of Roland Iron Fist, and they just wanted to watch him. So this is a very middle of the pack thing. It's going to be going at D tier, just because there's not a lot to it. Although the aesthetic is nice, I would put it at the highest end of D tier possible. I just can't put it at a C tier because there's just not enough there. The next one's in a very similar vein. Funny how that turns out. We have the Dragon's Lair with Longfang Witherhide, the Paladin promotion quest. It's, once again, it's one room. You go in, you fight one dragon, and that's it. You either kill the dragon, leave, or fail to kill the dragon, and also leave. Hopefully with everybody intact. There's a few bones in there, and that's cool. They're worth 1,000 apiece in Freehaven. I'm going to be putting this one at D tier too. I don't know any lore on Longfang Witherhide. I don't know how he fit through the door. I really couldn't tell you. It's just a very standard type of quest that you would expect with, frankly, a lackluster dungeon. Not a ton to say about it. The next one up is another early dungeon. It's the Dragoon's Cavern. So the Dragoon's Cavern, it ties back into the abandoned temple. You fight a lot of humanoids. It's just the guards and the ruffians, plus oozes. So for all the benefits of having two of my more favored types of enemies to fight, melee humanoids, it's going to be losing a lot of points because I hate oozes. They fall under that same category in my head as elementals. They're just not fun to fight. There's no loot. They break your gear. I think they can poison you. I'm pretty sure they can poison you. And just overall, it's not a good time fighting those. But they're optional. You never, ever need to fight the oozes in there. And so the rest of the dungeon, if you just ignore that section, you don't miss out on anything. You still get a good dungeon experience. It's not too long. There's a little bit of mystery in there. It just feels good, especially for the level that you'd be doing it at. It's just a good dungeon. There's no crazy puzzle elements to it outside of, you know, the little bit already addressed. So I'm going to put this at the highest end of B tier possible, and I think that's a fair assessment. Although I enjoy those enemies, there's better dungeons for fighting those enemies. Bringing us to the Dragon's Keep, which is the bigger brother of the Dragon's Caverns, so it's the same concept. I'm about 90% sure there's still ruffians in there. It's either ruffians and or swordsmen mixed with the veteran class of enemies, which are the more heavily armored. Those are all fun to fight. They come in bulk. It's a lot of fun to just mow them down. There's a good bit of optional content in that dungeon too. And one thing that I just really appreciate in that dungeon, especially if you put it in the context of the time, there's the one section in there where you go into these little holding cell kind of things where they might keep a prisoner or something, and it traps you in and spawns rats, and it's like, rats. Oh, rats again. You hear footsteps, and there's ads behind you. I don't know if anybody considers that impressive by today's standards, but at the time, I can definitely appreciate that that was a huge wrench in the whole plan. If you weren't expecting it, then I mean, that's definitely an interesting encounter to run into. I love the enemies. I really, really just deeply appreciate that that was a thing with the rats and the holding cells and all that. It's not long, the aesthetic is fine, nothing crazy about it. And then you get Mordred at the very end. Well, Mordred's not actually that good. That might be a hot take to some people, but it only does a little bit more damage than a regular Divine Dagger, plus a Vampiric. So you'd be better off with an Of Darkness Divine Dagger, which is rare, sure, but attack faster, plus Vampiric. Well, we're already better, losing 1 point of damage, which you'll never notice. There's just better options. So that in and of itself, neither a plus nor a minus. Whenever you get Mordred, if you do this at an appropriate level, solid. Later down the line, you should probably replace Mordred. All that together, I'm putting it at the A tier. I really appreciate this dungeon. That's going to bring us to the Freehaven Sewers. If there's anybody that likes the Freehaven Sewers, I would love to hear why you like them so much. There's some rats, there's some acolytes, and the Prince of Thieves lives down there with his merry band of thieves, and that's fun, I suppose. It's not a lot, it's a little long, although easy. No major puzzle elements, it just ties into other things, like the Shadow Guild. You can wind up in the sewers at the Shadow Guild, I think. Pretty sure. It's nothing crazy. There's nothing detracting from it too much. It's very C tier, and I think it's where I'm going to leave it. It's just kind of a hub for everything that you kind of don't want in the sewers. This is the wet wipes in your drain. So the next up, we have Garrick's Forge. Garrick's Forge is awful. I personally don't like it. I think it's long. The one puzzle in there is zero fun. With the levers and all that. Just use the jump spell and skip the whole thing. It's not worth the time. There's really no benefit to it. You go in, I think you get a Terrax crystal, which would mean that this is the Archmage promotion quest. So there you go. Corrigan State is the council quest. I'm pretty sure. It's got elementals and status effects and all that. It's not fun. I personally don't enjoy this one. I blast through as quick as I can. As far as redeeming factors go, I can't think of any. It's just a dungeon that I try to skip. I'm going to put this at an F tier. I personally do not like it. So that's going to bring us up next to Goblin Watch. So Goblin Watch is probably the first dungeon you're going to do. It's not too long, it's not too hard. There is one element of puzzle in the whole thing, and that is the key code thing, the no-bog. And that's cool. It's not too complicated. I don't exactly know why it exists. I went in and looked, and I couldn't exactly figure out why there's a cave system down there in the first place. I don't really know, because if you kind of look at the whole thing, it just seems like maybe the far corners are just where they stored treasure or something, or maybe buried somebody. I don't really understand the lore to it. I do appreciate the irony of Goblin Watch being overrun with goblins. I think that's funny. It's a good dungeon, nothing crazy about it. So this would be a C tier dungeon. But the one thing that I'm going to give it is the foreshadowing that it has with the backwards monks, right? Where it kind of shows you that you need to read things backwards. And it doesn't really apply later, but in the Tomb of Varn, if you read the names backwards and it's Star Trek characters, this foreshadows that. And because of that one thing, I'm putting it at the lowest end of B tier. Some people might like it more because goblins are fun to fight, but I think that it's the lowest end of B tier. Halls of the Fire Lord. Go ahead and move that into the F section. It is a basically optional dungeon that I basically opt out of doing every single time. You get amber, and that's great. You can sell amber, or I think you can get some crystal skulls. That'll help in the Tomb of Varn, and that's great. But I just don't want to do it. The whole puzzle element is too big, too elaborate, and it's not fun. Too convoluted. Even though I like the enemies in there, it's just not fun. Everything that benefits this dungeon, it has a quest, it has fun enemies, there's a lore aspect to it, is detracted from I take real life physical damage just knowing that I might have to go into this dungeon, and that's enough for me to not want to be in there. I'm giving it the F tier. I don't like it. Now, on a very far end, we have Icewind Keep. Puzzle elements, you flip 2 switches, and that's pretty much it. It's not terribly crazy, but where this one gets a lot of points, in my opinion, it is a short, quick, and to-the-point dungeon with nothing but enemies that I enjoy fighting. There are ogres in there, there are guards in there, and there might maybe be swordsmen, but I don't remember the top of my head. But it's those melee fighter types that I just enjoy fighting in a dungeon that respects your time. I'm giving this an A tier. I don't off the top of my head remember why this place exists, but I imagine it was to guard a road or something in Whitecap, and that's probably why it's a thing. So, lore things, not too crazy. There's a promotion quest in there where you get the keys for the Dragon Towers, and that's fantastic. So the reward for the whole thing, not worrying about Dragon Towers, I mean, That's massive. It's fantastic. But it gets so many points for just being an easy, quick dungeon with all the monsters that I want to fight. And that's why I'm giving it the A tier. So next up is the Lair of the Wolf. There's a lot of oozes. It's a decently long dungeon, but the lore is pretty solid. And one thing that I really appreciate about this place is that it takes the by any other name concept and applies it. It has the werewolves, but then it has the swordsmen. And the swordsmen are just werewolves not in werewolf form at the time. Well, the swordsmen are also used in other places as Silverhelm fighters, or dragoons, or whatever else they are. So by any other name, I think it's a cool concept how they did that. I couldn't tell you why oozes are in there at all, but they are. There's a couple of quests in there with the two pearls of putrescence and purity. There's a werewolf leader who is always a very hard fight because they have that insta-kill ability, and it's going to lose points for that one. But it's a dungeon that more or less can respect your time if you just skip the oozes because they're not fun to deal with. You fight enemies that are pretty fun to fight, and there's a lot of them, just like with Icewind Keep. So you can still feel good mowing down these enemies without the status effects and things. If you just get really unlucky and get a couple back-to-back insta-kills, instant KOs, then, you know, you might have a different experience, but I'm going to give this a B tier. I think that all things considered, it's pretty solid. I like fighting the werewolves. I think they're easy enough and fun enough. I like fighting human fighter types. They're pretty good. The loot in here is fine, with some quests and some deeper lore behind the whole thing with, I think his name is John Silverhand, I don't remember off the top of my head. But there's a deeper thing there. I think that's neat. I appreciate it for what it is. So up next is and this may or may not count. So I threw it in anyway because I'm taking pretty much any interior cell as a dungeon. We have the New World Computing Dungeon. There's no fair way to rank this one. In my playthroughs, I don't use it because I adhere to Primus Guidebook. But in pretty much every playthrough that I've ever done, besides that one, or besides the recorded ones, I always use it. Everybody always uses it. Absolute Zero uses it. It's in the game. You can get to it within 2 minutes. You can get to it within 1 minute of starting the game. And you can get some loot. You get some infernos, unlimited money, some armor. However you want to do it, it just works out. So there's no downside to it. There's nothing but upsides. It's just, I don't know if it counts. So I'm going to put it at a C tier, but it's because I just don't swing either way on it. I appreciate that it's there. I like what it does. I also just don't use it. It is what it is. I'm sure most people put that at S tier because of the utility. Take it for what it is. So up next is the Shadow Guild's Hideout. So the Shadow Guild Hideout, it's in Castle Iron Fist, and it's the 4th or 5th-ish dungeon you would do, kind of depending. And I really like this dungeon. Thieves are a little bit brutal at the time that you should be doing this, roughly level 10 to 15 or so. They can steal your things, but that doesn't happen often. They can insta-kill you, doesn't happen that often. They're not too bad. But it's a pretty short dungeon with some quests in it, and a lot of stat boosts. So if you go in, you're going to come out a little bit stronger, a good bit of extra money, plus ruffians. I enjoy fighting ruffians. They're probably, if not my favorite, one of my favorite enemy types to fight. I appreciate this for what it is. It respects your time. There's a little bit of a puzzle element just with having to go all the way around and then open the one trapped door. I think it's a good dungeon. There's not a ton to say about it, but it is solid. I appreciate that. I'm gonna give it a B tier. Up next is the Shadow Guild. This one goes both ways. I very routinely skip this one because it's basically optional. As far as the lore goes, to find the Prince of Thieves, you probably would have to go in there if you don't just know where he is. So I guess there's that. I just don't have to go in there for any reason, and I forgot about one of the coolest things about the dungeon. So it's filled with thieves and cut purses, I think, and there's one genie in there. The only unique genie, a lesser genie, which is its name. It's I think it's weaker than all the other types of genies, so that whenever you should be in that dungeon, you can actually beat him. And it's interesting that he exists. I don't know why he exists. It's just interesting that he's there, because most of this dungeon is just a pretty typical thing. It's tight corridors, it's little skirmishes here and there in melee combat, it's nothing crazy. But in the back of this dungeon, there's a puzzle that I just forget about all the time. I constantly forget about it. But I actually went and looked through it. Also, as a fun side note, whenever I did my full clear of the game for parts 21 through 27 of my first Let's Play, I actually forgot about this whole dungeon, but is what it is. We just are going to ignore that. In the back of it, there's a room where you have to jump on the floor a certain type of way, and it'll teleport you to this secret area. And in the secret area, if you get that far, there is the genie and some cut purses or some thieves or whatever's in there. It doesn't even matter. Maybe some ruffians or swordsmen or something. But there's 4 doors. Each one has a riddle, and they're not hard riddles. I mean, you can Google the answers. It's like time, fish, a water, and a tree or something. It's nothing crazy. But they'll teleport you to other places in the world. So depending on how you want to use it, if you have the Lloyd's Beacon set there, you could maybe make some real use out of that. Because one goes to Iron Fist, I think one goes to the sewers. I think one goes back to the start of the dungeon. And don't know where the last one goes on the top of my head. I don't know, maybe the Dragoon's Caverns? Not the Keep, but the Caverns? I don't remember. But it's such an interesting puzzle element, especially because you would have to work a little bit to figure it out if you don't just know it. I'm gonna give this one an A tier. I skip it a lot, but that last secret area is just really interesting to me, and I really appreciate it. And then we come to the Silverhelm Outpost. The Silverhelm Outpost is the one dungeon in Mist. It has guards, it has swordsmen. I think there might maybe be a single fighter in there, the veteran class. And there's a few monks and maybe a rat or something. Maybe a rat. I don't remember. It's an interesting dungeon. I don't particularly know why it's in Mist. I'm sure there's some lore reason, but beyond that, it gives you a key to Garrick's Forge, and that's interesting enough in itself. So you have to go in there, and I guess that makes sense because Albert Newton sent you to Garrick's Forge for his own reasons to get the Terex crystal, I think. It's one or the other, I can't remember. But the reason that I'm going to give this one an S tier is because I enjoy fighting all those enemies. It's not a hard, long, drawn-out dungeon. It respects your time. I don't have the attention span for super long dungeons. I just don't like them. So, I'm going to give it the S tier. I enjoy the enemies. There's not a crazy puzzle element beyond the staircase that bugs out all the time. It's just a good classic dungeon. It feels like something that you would do at like, level 2 or 3 in a D&D game, and I really appreciate that. So the next up is the Silverhelm Stronghold. So the Silverhelm Stronghold kind of picks up where the Lair of the Wolf is leaving off. Off the top of my head, I don't think there's any quests that send you in there. So it's a pretty optional place to go. It's got guards, probably veterans, fighters for sure, because they're Silverhelms. Those types of deals. Melee fighters that I enjoy fighting, and there's one mage. Although if you right click on him, he doesn't have a name, he is named. And he carries the Ankh, and that's where it picks up where the Lair of the Wolf leaves off. The Ankh belonged to John Silverhelm, or something along those lines. I don't remember the exact story. But you go turn that into Loretta Fleece, and she gives you some rewards or whatever it is, and that's all cool and good. But it's a good dungeon. It has those deeper lore elements that maybe tie into one or two other things. It ties into the Lair of the Wolf with the Silverhelms and all that. It ties into Loretta Fleece. It gives you an extra character that you would have to go out of your way to figure out that he exists. And the monsters are fun to fight. There's not any crazy puzzle elements that come to mind. If you help out John Silverhelm, it gives you access to a secret area, and that's pretty neat. I'm going to go ahead and rank this one at an A tier. I enjoyed this dungeon. So next up we have Snurgle's Cavern. Snurgle has two dungeons. The first one is his cavern, which would actually be the second dungeon you do. Snurgle's Cavern, you need the key to finish it and actually get to Snurgle himself. So there is a quest associated with this dungeon. Now, I'm going to be giving this one a very high rating based on one detail alone, and that's that I love how this dungeon looks. I love the crystals and the bones. I love the mushrooms, the waterfalls. I love the number of secrets. I think the cave-in mechanic could have been used more. I love it. If my only complaint is there's not enough of it, that's basically a good thing, in my opinion. Dwarves are fun enough to fight, even though they're a little bit tanky, but thus is the nature of dwarves. The loot is marginal-ish. It's nothing super crazy. But the aesthetic, I love how this place looks. Absolutely love it. I think it is the most beautiful dungeon in the whole game. And for that, it gets S tier on that alone. The lore is a little bit hidden to kind of explain why these dwarves are bad guys, but it's because they made a deal with Xenophax, the king of the devils, and all that kind of thing. The enemies themselves, I think there might be some oozes in there. I don't remember. If there are, I don't remember them. I do, however, know that there are oozes that are basically unavoidable in Snurgle's Iron Mine, the next dungeon on our list. Unavoidable oozes is, that is a mortal sin. I don't like them. I don't want to fight them. They're not fun. The dungeon layout is pretty solid, if a little on the long side, but this is the one that you have to do to be able to go fight Snurgle and his army of dwarves that apparently have a ton of back ads. If you want to go see what I'm talking about, go watch our last Let's Play. The back ads are insane when you go fight Snurgle, but in the Iron Mines, you have to go get the key to let you into Snurgle's den. So this is why you do this one first. The unavoidable oozes aren't fun. There's a few devils, and that plays back into the lore. So it gets some points for the lore, but it's a little long. It's a little convoluted in a way. It respects you because it has health and mana pools in the dungeon. And I think that's just a really nice feature that helps out a pretty good bit. All in all, it's losing a lot of points on the oozes, in my opinion, but the lore is making up for that, so that comes out dead even. The aesthetic isn't amazing, but the enemies are fun to fight. I'm going to be putting this one at C tier. So the next one on the list, we have the Superior Temple of Ba. I hate this dungeon. I hate it. I know about the perception thing. We all know the perception thing. We all know that you need perception to know that you need perception. It's whatever. That's irrelevant. Needing to invest those skill points, not a huge loss. It's annoying that you have to do it. It is what it is. You can only go in once if you lose the cape, and that just, once again, is what it is, because I don't want to go back in the first place. It is a very long dungeon, full of magicians and druids. Druids can drain your mana. Magicians do a lot of damage and apply status effects. I don't know how half the puzzles in this dungeon work. I don't know how to be a follower of Ba or whatever and get that XP for that. I don't want to fight through the army of casters. I don't like this dungeon. It's too long. The enemies are not fun. The puzzles make no sense to me. You can go in and get out relatively fast, but it's just not fun. I don't even think there's any extra lore to it. The loot's fine, sure. But like the other dungeons that I just don't want to deal with, it's going down here. I do not like this dungeon. It's an F tier dungeon. Next up is the Supreme Temple of Ba. Now, this one has more stuff on the nose than the Abandoned Temple. The Supreme Temple of Ba is the one in Iron Fist that connects, in my opinion, connects to the Abandoned Temple. But it's not going to be getting any of those points, because this is its own thing. It's a pretty short dungeon that's not too bad. There's a lot of skeletons to fight, and there's some acolytes, and they're a little bit of a challenge, can be, at the appropriate level, that is. But it's not a bad dungeon. It's not too long. You don't have to fight through all the corners of the place if you don't want to. So you can get in, get out pretty quick. All you need is the Chimes of Harmony. So everything from the corners of the dungeon to the gong, solid. I enjoy the skeleton fight. I think that it's a good fight. I think it's fun and interesting. I appreciate that the AI pathing is bad, so it's not a terribly hard fight, but I don't like the status effects. That's not a huge deterrent, though. The one thing that kills me about this dungeon is that the puzzle element in this dungeon, there's two of them. The first is a set of keys, and it's no big deal. It can be a time loss if you don't know what you're doing. but it's just a time loss. It's not that important. What kills me is that opening the doors in the central room, as far as I know, even the developers don't know where the clue was supposed to be. It just doesn't make any sense. We all know that you open them north, east, west, south, news, and we know that's the answer, but I was never able to find anything myself or find anybody that knows anything themselves that looks at all the information that we got and then applied it to find out the answer. The only thing that we can find out is that we look at the answer and then draw ties back until we find something that tells us how to do it. So what that means is there's no clues. It's just trial and error. If anybody knows any way to figure out the answer without knowing the answer and figuring out backwards, I would love to hear it. I don't know that it exists. I really don't. So, because I like the dungeon, I think it's pretty fun. I know the answer. I'm gonna rank it higher. But because I just feel like that's a really big oversight for what would probably be like the third or fourth dungeon you would do. If you were a new player, that'd be a little frustrating. So I'm going to be putting this one at a C tier. It would have been at a B tier because I enjoy the enemies and I enjoy that it respects your time, but it's losing all those points because it just doesn't make any sense. Now we have the Supreme Temple of Ba. So the Supreme Temple of Ba, it's in Hermits Isle, and in Hermits Isle, you fight through a lot of titans and hydras to get there, and you go in. It's a pretty hard dungeon. It's super easy to cheese it. You just jump out that little window on the right side, and just a jump spell or two, and it's pretty easy. You fight some elementals, and that's a little annoying. It is what it is. The overall dungeon layout is pretty long. It's a very intense dungeon in that regard. But I would say overall it's a very average dungeon. There's a portal that leads to the sewers, which makes the sewers more interesting, because if you found it on that end, you'd be like, why is there a teleporter here? That makes no sense. What's this for? Then the payoff later would be like, ah, there it is. So that would, if anything, give points to the sewers, but it doesn't give points to the Supreme Temple of Ba. It is what it is. You fight Slicker Silvertongue in there, and that's pretty interesting. He's surrounded by devils and things, and it's a pretty... If you use a lot of imagination, it's a very neat scene, whatever happens. There's some permanent buffs and things, that's all pretty good. But it's long, and typically I do skip this dungeon. Because I just don't particularly enjoy this dungeon, and I don't typically interact with the puzzle elements with the altars, I'm gonna rank this at D tier. Also, just occurred to me it's the wrong pictures. There we go. I just don't like it. It's not the worst by any means, but it's not the best. Up next is a bunch of temples that I have to make sure I sort through correctly. So I'm going to make sure I specify in case I get the pictures wrong. The first one is the Temple of the Fist. Now this one is the one right to the west. It's to the west of the mainland town of Bootleg Bay. You go in there to break a crystal or destroy an evil crystal for the abbot, I think, in the temple in Bootleg Bay on the main side. It's a very, very fast dungeon. I have never looked into the lore of it at all. It's very easy with tiniest bit of puzzle element because you have to go flip a switch or something, and you don't go into that middle room with the skulls because it weakens you or something. It's an average dungeon. It's very, very short, so it's like maybe the top end of D tier. It's right ahead of the one-room dungeons. There's just not enough there. Oh, I'll throw it right there. There you go. The order on the screen here doesn't matter if anybody's wondering. There's not a lot in the Temple of the Fist, so it's kind of just a moot point, really. We'll just move on. Temple of the Moon. Okay. So Temple of the Moon, that's where the Archdruid promotion is. Yes, the Archdruid. Grand Druid is at the Stonehenge. So this dungeon is pretty hard, I won't lie to you. Getting to it is a challenge in and of itself, but you have to get through archers, and that's rough. Druids, they drain your mana. Well, that's a big problem. For a well-built party, mana is very important. So druids aren't necessarily fun, but they're also very glass cannony. They're super easy to kill, and that's fine. They know their role. The loot in this dungeon is pretty solid. Not a huge deal there, because you can go in, loot all the stuff and things, and sell whatever you can't use. There are cobra eggs, and those are worth 300 a pop. That's solid. Now the puzzle element in this dungeon, I don't really like it. I don't think it's that interesting because it's very simple. You don't really have to think about it. It's just very time consuming. If there was a faster way to do it, then that'd be fantastic. Like if instead of here's the order in which you touch all the altars, now go touch them. If the altars told you, touch some buttons on the door in this order, and there were buttons on the door. Well, if you already know the code, you can skip all that. You go make one sweep through, kill everything, a sweep through on the other side, kill everything, and then proceed as normal. That'd be fine, but no, you have to run, I think, to the right, to the left, right, left, I think. I don't remember. It's just not a lot of fun. I don't like it. But now there is a secret room in the mid-left room. I don't know what altar it is. I think it might be life, but I don't remember. But in that room, there's a little bit of lore there that tells you a bit about the druids, and I think that's kind of interesting. So, what saves it from Medusas aren't fun to fight, because I don't mind the stone effect. I mind the paralyze effect. I don't like the enchantresses. The Gorgons, that's fine. The Medusa, that's fine. I don't like paralyze. So I'm going to give this a D tier for the lore instead of an F tier. That's what's going to save that one dungeon. Now in that same vein, we have the Temple of the Snake next. Temple of the Snake has a ton of Medusa. But it's a short dungeon. You make one sweep through and you leave. So Medusa, not my favorite thing to fight. If it was just a Medusa dungeon, then okay. I'll give it a D tier. But the Temple of Snake's a little more interesting than that. So the Temple of Snake has a gold dragon in it. I don't know how it got in there. I don't exactly know why it's in there. But I think that it's neat that it's in there, given that by the time you encounter this thing, this is likely to be your second dragon. That's a pretty hard encounter, and dragons are pretty fun to fight. I'd put them somewhere between top 5 and 10 favorite things to fight, maybe. But you're gonna fight with swords and some magic, and you'll have to get through it. Like it's hard. It's gonna be a hard fight. But once you beat that dragon, well, now you go into this back room, and that's where this is gonna get some points. It's a short dungeon. It isn't too bad. The loot is fantastic because you have access to all of the alchemy ingredients you'll ever need. But there's one thing in there that really sets it apart, and that is Q. I don't remember what he's a reference to, but everybody knows who I'm talking about. He's not a terribly hard monster to fight, despite having, I think, 11,000 hit points. I think it's 11,000. He's not in Primus Guidebook, but he drops the Horn of Ross. And the Horn of Ross is just such a quality of life increase that I love it. Even though he's not in Primus Guidebook, I'm going to get the Horn of Ross every single time. I'm going to. So because Q's in there, massive points. Unfortunately, that's only making up for, well, not only making up for, it's balancing out that I really enjoy Q being in the game. The alchemy ingredients are very nice. It's a short dungeon. It respects your time. But I don't like Medusa, and there's no real lore in and of itself. And the location around the dungeon isn't factored in, but it's supposed to be in a forest. I didn't know that until I found that out like 3 days ago. So balancing those things together, it's going to be a B tier. The aesthetic isn't great, the monsters aren't too fun, but if it was just Q, this would be an S tier. Q alone saves it from a D tier. Temple of the Sun is up next. Super short dungeon. I think it's literally 3 rooms. There's a Minotaur Lord in there. He guards a pretty big treasure room. There's not too many monks. This is in Bootleg Bay on the island to the west. It's pretty easy. There's a chalice there that'll let you become a high priest. And that's interesting in and of itself, I suppose. Sure. But it's a short dungeon, pretty easy. The loot is outstanding. Plus there's a Minotaur. It'll probably be the first Minotaur you encounter in the game. So just like the Gold Dragon, just all of a sudden, oh, here's a high level monster. And it's the highest tier of that high level monster. How are you going to beat that? And you figure it out. I'm going to give it a C tier. There's not a ton saving it from being, too low. But there's nothing that's going to make it very good. So it's a very solid C tier dungeon. And the one that I've been dreading. Okay, so the Temple of Snasta. I still haven't done any research on this one. Every single time I enter the Temple of Snasta, I think about Might and Magic Dark Messiah. I think that Snasta is the spider god lady thing. I have no idea. It seems right in my head, and if none of this is making any sense to anybody, then just ignore it. If I could understand that like the deity aspect of my magic lore a little better, I might be able to parse this one a little bit better, but I don't know, and therefore I'm pretty sure that it's interesting because that would in a way mean that it has ties to my Magic Dark Messiah. I don't know. There's a Dark Messiah retrospective that's worth watching. I don't remember the name of the gentleman that did that video. You would know it's the guy that really hates spiders, absolutely hates them, who also edits videos a lot better than me. His spider jokes are hilarious. I had to put it a D tier. I just don't know enough about the lore, me personally, to justify putting it higher. And it's not a C tier because it's a little bit too long. If you don't pull the levers in the right order, it just stops respecting your time. Cannibals are fun enough to fight, sure. I may have briefly talked about the issues with that, but you have to look at it in the context of this game came out in '98 and understand that. It doesn't bother me personally, but I also recognize that they were going for a Pirates of the Caribbean thing before that was a thing. So not going too deep into all that. I'm gonna throw it at the D tier. It's a little bit long. I don't know enough about it. I'd rather just avoid this dungeon. So now we're down to 5. So the Hive, the very last dungeon you do. Once you go into the Hive, you have blasters and things, so it's not hard. Devils aren't the worst to fight, but they're not the best. They're super middle of the pack. The aesthetic is unnerving, as I think it was designed to be, and I can appreciate that they kind of nailed that. I'm not giving points to it, but the soundtrack is pretty solid, I won't lie to you. I like it. The Reactor and the Devil Queen are unique enemies, and the Devil Queen is one of the ugliest things I've ever seen in my whole life. It's a little tedious. It's not the best. The lore is fine. I appreciate that it is that sci-fi element that no dungeon so far has really touched on. I'm gonna put it at a C tier. Not a lot. It's average. It's a good ending, but the game really ends a little bit earlier on. So up next is a Monolith. Now this one's monsters. This could be a little bit hypocritical, but so you fight a lot of elementals in here. Okay, cool. I don't like elementals. Well, water elementals aren't too bad, and earth elementals, very neutral. So average those out, and that still comes to the bottom of C tier. Druids, I understand them. Okay, fine. Well, I don't like the monsters. Okay, makes sense. Now the lore. Well, why are these druids bad? Because typically I have a druid in my party. I like druids. Druids in Might Magic 6 are they are the pinnacle of the mid-game. They're not late game, but they're fun to have around. The middle of the game is the fun part. They contribute a lot to DPS, which is something that feral druids just don't do. So, I don't like the monsters. Okay. There's a quest associated with it. Okay, that's fine. There's lore with the Cedric clan of druids or whatever. That's cool. So why is this one about to get a decent rating? Well, the reason that it's above an average dungeon is because the aesthetic is nice and the puzzle elements are good. The puzzle isn't hard, I just appreciate it for what it is. Touch this tree, touch that rock, smell these flowers. Don't touch the monolith, you'll get cursed. Cool. There's fantastic loot. There's a plant in there that just gives you $5,000. That's fantastic. And the aesthetic is just so nice. I love the aesthetic. It just looks good. Not as good as the mushrooms and gems of Snurgle's Cavern, but the aesthetic is very, very nice. And because of that, I'm going to give it a B tier, but it's like the highest end of B tier I can possibly give it. If the monsters were just a little bit more fun, it would have been the bottom of A tier. I just don't particularly enjoy those monsters. So next on the list we have the Tomb of Etheric the Mad. Okay. So this one hits a little close to home. I played a D&D game back in high school for about 2.5 years until me and best friend both went to boot camp, and then, you know, kind of fell apart. We went our two different ways, and we stayed in touch, you know, until September 10th, 2018. We were best friends. But in that D&D game, he had Etheric, who was basically stolen from this dungeon. And so I can't disassociate the Tomb of Etheric the Mad, Etheric and the monster, from that D&D game. Etheric has a history and lore in the My Magic universe. The dungeon's fine, sure. It's just that none of that matters to me. It's that what Etheric represents in that D&D game is very sentimental. People are welcome to disagree with me, but this is the highest tier I can give it. If there was an S+, I'd put it there. Can maybe try to move it over or something. There you go. It's, for sentimental reasons, Etheric and what he represents, this is my favorite dungeon. So the Tomb of Varn is next. Now, this one's going to be very controversial. Okay. So the Tomb of Varn, some people consider it to be the best dungeon in any game ever. Okay, great. That's fine. Some people don't like it for whatever reason. You know, there's a couple of reasons. Now, in my personal opinion, because remember, this is all personal, unrehearsed, there's no script or anything. My issue with the Tomb of Varn, I don't appreciate how long it is. It is very hard, it is very difficult to navigate and to fight through. It's a long dungeon. So even after all this time, I still struggle with it sometimes. Finding all the keys and the chests and all the stuff, I just don't like it. I don't particularly enjoy fighting the enemies. Now we're going to put a pin in that topic for just a second. I want to talk about the enemies in just a minute. But it's too long. I don't want to spend an hour in a dungeon. I just don't like that. I want dungeons to be 15 to 25 minutes. That's a good period of time. I want to be able to go in, do the dungeon, and leave. I don't want to go in, do a little bit, and leave, come back. A little bit more, leave, come back. I don't want to do all that. It's not my thing. I don't like that. So the Tomb of Varn should really be several dungeons in itself, but it's not. So that's my main two criticisms. I don't like the enemies. I don't like the length. Now, the puzzle aspect. Well, the puzzle aspect is part of the reason I don't like it. It's super long. I do appreciate the names and the key codes, you know, Crick and K-Cops, and Arhu. I think that's neat. I appreciate that for what it is, okay? It's cool. So that's kind of where we're at with that one. Now, the one thing here that is going to save it from the top of F tier is that I have a theory, and this one's very far-fetched. But whenever I personally believe it, okay? Whenever I personally believe this theory, it moves it from the F tier up to relatively low D tier, okay? So I was asking around to try to figure out, why are there genies in this dungeon? And some things came back. Okay, well, it's just thematic, it's a pyramid in a desert, that's the theme. It's Egypt. Okay, well, I'll buy that. Okay, sure. Well, what are genies? Well, genies, they're typically associated with the plane of air from Might and Magic 8. Well, okay, cool. But that's my Magic 8. That was early 2000s or something. I think that was way later. So why are they here? Well, my theory is that given that the elementals are effectively the building blocks for life, and they came roughly on Varn, which is the Vehicular Astrological Research Narsil, meaning this is where they kept the astronauts on a much larger spaceship. This is the actual part of the spaceship that shoots off and the rocket falls apart. This is the part with the astronauts in it. So knowing that, it's interesting, because if that's what the elementals are in this radiation, then my line of thinking was that genies are radiation elementals. In this context, in the context of Might and Magic 6, with no outside knowledge, I've never played 1 through 5, I've barely touched 7, and 8 through 10, I don't know them. I've maybe seen a Let's Play of one of those. So knowing about the radiation elementals thing, that's going to bring it up to that D tier for me. Because I believe it, because I think it's just super interesting, even though I do not enjoy fighting any monster in this dungeon, including the robots. I just don't like it. And then the Defenders of Varn are also robots. They're kind of stand-ins for angels in a way. They fight the Kregan, but whatever happened, they're bad guys. They fight you too. I don't know about that one. But the radiation elementals, I think that's an interesting concept. That's my interpretation of it. So it's D tier. Well, no, it's not D tier. And here's why it's not D tier to me. I don't think it's D tier because this is the point of the game where it should start really clicking that you're not playing a fantasy game. Sure, you have dragons, wizards, swords, arrows, cool. You're on a spaceship fighting robots. You're dealing with radiation. You're looking for a control cube. This is a sci-fi game. And this is where that becomes apparent. And there's lore in the dungeon that makes that all make sense. And so, because this is where all that becomes apparent, and the radiation elementals, despite its flaws, it's going to land in the C tier for me. Now, some people are going to love this dungeon, some people are going to hate it. It's middle of the pack for all the reasons besides the actual dungeon itself. It's an interesting take. And that brings us to the last dungeon. the Warlord's Fortress. So the Warlord's Fortress, typically, whenever I think about this one for the Knight Promotion Quest, I'm like, you know, this is a hard dungeon. I should probably wait to go in there. There are Death Knights, there's Ruffians, there's Fighters, and Guards, and Veterans. It's not that bad. It really isn't. I enjoy fighting all those enemies. The aesthetic is lackluster, and I just don't really like the aesthetic, honestly. The puzzle element, not a huge deal. It's just like a little maze. It's not even hard. No challenge to it whatsoever. Some keys you have to use. Sure, that's fine. I just enjoy the monsters here. So it's a pretty solid dungeon for what it is. There's nothing super bad about it, nothing super good. So I'm gonna give it the benefit of the doubt because it only has monsters that I enjoy fighting. I'm gonna give it a B tier. I think that's fair. And that's gonna bring us to the end of the video. This is my ranking for the dungeons. It's all very subjective. If you have any differing opinions on any of these, let me know. If you think that any of my information was bad or wrong, by all means, let me know. That's fine. And if someone wants to make a video in rebuttal and do your own list, I believe that this is now publicly accessible on tiermaker.com. If you want to do that, go for it. But for now, thank you all for watching. I hope you can have some kind of discussion over this tier list, and I hope to hear back from anybody with any opinions. So once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.